Here is the interesting debate between Laura Ingraham and Jasmine Crockett. Laura Ingraham thought she had the perfect target when Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett agreed to appear on her show. The Fox News host had been sharpening her attack for weeks, calling Crockett another radical Democrat who doesn't understand real America. But what happened in the next 30 minutes left Ingraham completely speechless, and may have just ended her reputation as an unbeatable political interview forever. The studio lights blaze as two of America's most powerful women faced off in what would become the political showdown of the year. Ingraham, confident in her home turf advantage, had no idea she was about to meet her match in the brilliant Texas congresswoman who had been quietly preparing the perfect counterattack. What made this confrontation even more explosive were the weeks of buildup that had led to this moment. Ingraham had been targeting Crockett for months, calling her another progressive who thinks Twitter activism equals real leadership. She had mocked Crockett's background, questioned her intelligence, and even suggested that she was playing the race card to advance her career. These attacks hadn't gone unnoticed by Crockett's team, who had been carefully documenting every slight, every insult, every attempt to diminish their congresswoman's credibility. The irony was delicious. Ingraham thought she was setting up an easy target, a young politician she could embarrass on national television to boost her own ratings. Instead, she was about to hand Crockett the perfect platform to introduce herself to millions of Americans as a force to be reckoned with. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, so you never miss these explosive political moments. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let's see how Jasmine Crockett turned Laura Ingraham's own show into a personal victory stage. The tension in Studio B at Fox News was electric, as makeup artists put the finishing touches on two women who couldn't be more different. Laura Ingraham, the 60-year-old conservative firebrand, sat in her signature chair reviewing her notes one last time. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled, her navy blazer crisp and authoritative. She had built her career on taking down liberal politicians, and tonight she planned to add another scout to her collection. Behind the scenes, Ingraham production team was buzzing with excitement. They had spent the afternoon crafting what they believed would be devastating attack lines, pulling clips and statistics they thought would embarrass Crockett. The show's producers had even prepared backup questions designed to trap the congresswoman if she managed to deflect the initial attacks. They were confident this would be another classic Ingraham takedown that would generate headlines and boost ratings. What they didn't know was that across town, Crockett's small but dedicated team had been conducting their own war room preparations. While Ingraham's people focused on attack lines, Crockett's team had been building a comprehensive defense and counterattack strategy that would turn every expected assault into an opportunity. Across the studio, Jasmine Crockett adjusted her earpiece and checked her phone one final time. The 43-year-old African-American congresswoman from Texas looked composed but determined. Her natural hairstyle was elegantly wearing a burgundy blazer that commanded respect. Unlike many politicians who wilted under Ingraham's aggressive questioning style, Crockett had been looking forward to this moment for months. Her burgundy blazer had been chosen deliberately, a color that would stand out against the Fox News set's blue tones, while projecting both power and approachability. Even her jewelry had been selected strategically, simple pearl earrings that conveyed professionalism without distraction, and a gold cross necklace that subtly emphasized her faith and values. Every detail of her appearance had been calculated to project confidence and competence. In a briefcase at her side, 3 manila folders each contained carefully organized research that her team had spent weeks compiling. The first contained Ingraham's most controversial statements and contradictions. The second held detailed policy papers that could counter any attack on her legislative record. The third, which she hoped she wouldn't need to use, contained information so damaging about Ingraham's past that could end careers. The stage was set for a battle that would reshape both their careers. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who these two powerhouses really are and what brought them to this moment. Laura Ingraham had spent decades building her media empire, from her early days in radio to becoming one of Fox News's biggest stars. She had perfected the art of the political takedown. Her show, The Ingraham Angle, regularly drew millions of viewers who tuned in to watch a demolished Democratic politician with surgical precision. She was known for her quick wit, her ability to find the weakest point in any argument, and a talent for making even experienced politicians look foolish on national television. Ingraham had been particularly critical of a new wave of young Democratic congresswomen, calling them out of touch with real American values. She had set her sights on Jasmine Crockett weeks earlier, repeatedly mentioning her on the show and questioning her qualifications to represent Texas in Congress. Tonight was supposed to be Ingraham's moment to expose what she called another progressive politician who talks big but delivers nothing. But Crockett was nothing like the politicians Ingraham was used to facing. Born and raised in Missouri before moving to Texas, Crockett had worked her way up from humble beginnings to become one of the most respected attorneys in Dallas. She had built her reputation defending working families and taking on powerful corporations that tried to exploit everyday Americans. Her path to Congress wasn't handed to her. She had earned every step through hard work, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to fighting for justice. What made Crockett particularly dangerous as an opponent was her legal background. As a former public defender and civil rights attorney, she had spent years going up against prosecutors, judges, and corporate lawyers who thought they could intimidate her. She had learned to stay calm under pressure, to think 3 steps ahead of her opponents, and most importantly, to never let anyone underestimate her because of her age, race, or gender. Her preparation for this interview had been meticulous. Crockett's team had compiled opposition research that would make even the most seasoned political operatives jealous. They had video clips, quotes, voting records, and financial disclosures dating back decades. They had studied every interview Ingraham had ever conducted, noting her favorite attack lines, her go-to interruption tactics, and the moments when she was most vulnerable to counterattacks. But beyond the research, Crockett brought something that couldn't be taught or prepared: an authentic connection to the struggles of working Americans. Unlike many politicians who spoke about hardship from a distance, Crockett had lived it. She knew what it meant to work multiple jobs, to pay for college, to face discrimination in professional settings, and to fight for recognition in spaces where she wasn't welcome. The stakes couldn't have been higher for Ingraham. This was about maintaining her reputation as a conservative movement's most effective media warrior. A strong performance would cement her position and potentially damage a rising Democratic star. For Crockett, this was a chance to introduce herself to a national audience and prove that the new generation of Democratic leaders could hold their own against anyone, even on hostile territory. The personal animosity between them had been building for months. Ingraham had repeatedly questioned Crockett's intelligence and experience on her show, suggesting that she was nothing more than another diversity hire who didn't belong in Congress. These attacks hadn't gone unnoticed by Crockett, who had been quietly preparing for the day when she would get her chance to respond face to face. The final straw had come just 2 weeks earlier, when Ingraham devoted an entire segment to mocking Crockett's background, playing clips of her speaking at community events and suggesting that she was out of her league in national politics. The segment had been particularly cruel, with Ingraham producers editing Crockett's words to make her appear less articulate than she actually was. What Ingraham didn't realize was that this attack had only strengthened Crockett's resolve. The Congresswoman had spent the following weeks preparing, not just talking points, but a comprehensive strategy to turn the tables on her attacker. She had studied Ingraham's own history, her contradictions, her vulnerabilities, and her past moments of public embarrassment. What neither woman knew was that this confrontation would expose something much deeper than just political differences. It would reveal the clash between old guard media tactics and a new generation of politicians who refuse to be intimidated. Between assumptions about who deserves respect and the reality of earned authority. Between those who think they can control the narrative and those who are ready to rewrite it entirely. The countdown clock showed 30 seconds to air time. Both women took deep breaths, knowing that the next half hour would define their relationship with American politics for years to come. The red recording light flashed on, and Laura Ingraham launched into her show with the confidence of someone who had done this thousands of times before. "Good evening, I'm Laura Ingraham, and this is the Ingraham Angle," she began, her voice carrying a familiar blend of authority and barely contained aggression. "Tonight, we're joined by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett from Texas, one of the many new Democratic faces who claimed to represent the future of their party." The way she said claim made it clear this wasn't going to be a friendly interview. Crockett appeared on the split screen, maintaining perfect composure despite being in the lion's den. She had studied hours of Ingraham's interviews, noting every tactic, every interruption pattern, every way the host tried to throw her off balance. "Congresswoman Crockett," Ingraham continued, shuffling her papers in a way that suggested she had devastating information ready to deploy. "You've been in Congress less than 2 years, yet you seem to think you have all the answers for America's problems. Tell me, what exactly qualifies you to lecture the rest of us about how this country should be run?" It was a classic Ingraham opening, aggressive, dismissive, and designed to put a guest immediately on the defensive. Most politicians would have stumbled into explaining their resume or getting defensive about their experience, but Crockett had a different strategy. "Laura," she began, her voice calm, "I think that's exactly the wrong question. The real question is, why someone who's never had to worry about whether they can afford health care, never faced discrimination, and never had to fight for basic civil rights, thinks they are qualified to tell working Americans what's best for them." The studio fell silent for a moment. Crockett hadn't just deflected the attack, she had turned it around, and launched a counterattack in the most vulnerable spot. Her privileged background and disconnect from ordinary American struggles. Ingraham's eyes flashed with surprise and anger. She wasn't used to guests who fought back this quickly and effectively. But she had been doing this for decades, and she quickly regrouped. "Well, that's interesting," Ingraham said, her voice taking on that condescending tone that had become her trademark. "So, you think experience doesn't matter? You think just because someone has been successful, they can't understand regular Americans? That sounds like the kind of reverse discrimination that's destroying this country." But Crockett was ready for this, too. She had anticipated that Ingraham would try to twist her words and paint her as anti-successful, racist against white people. "No, Laura," Crockett replied, leaning forward slightly, her intensity growing. "That's why I think my experience as a public defender, representing people who couldn't afford high-priced lawyers, matters. My experience growing up in a working-class family matters. My experience fighting for civil rights matters. The question is whether your experience sitting in television studios making millions of dollars to attack working families really qualifies you to understand what most Americans are going through." The temperature in the studio seemed to rise 10 degrees. Ingraham's production team, watching from a control room, could sense that something unusual was happening. Their host, who usually dominated these exchanges, was being pushed back by a guest who seemed completely unintimidated. Ingraham tried a different approach, pulling out what she thought would be a trump card. "Let's talk about your record, Congresswoman. You voted for massive spending bills that have contributed to inflation. You supported policies that have hurt American workers. How do you justify that to the families who are struggling to put food on the table because of Democratic policies?" This was Ingram's specialty. Taking complex policy issues and reducing them to simple talking points that made Democrats look bad. She had used this tactic to embarrass dozens of politicians over the years. But Crockett had done her homework. She didn't just know the talking points. She knew the actual details of every bill she had voted for, and the real-world impact of those policies. Laura, let's be specific about what you're calling massive spending, Crockett said, her legal training kicking in. Are you talking about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that's creating millions of jobs and fixing the roads and bridges that were crumbling under Republican neglect? Are you talking about the Inflation Reduction Act that's lowering prescription drug costs for seniors? Or are you talking about the CHIPS Act that's bringing manufacturing jobs back to America? Ingraham tried to interrupt, but Crockett kept going. Her voice grew stronger with each word, because if you want to talk about policies that hurt working families, let's talk about the Republican tax cuts that gave billions to corporations, while adding nothing to working people's paychecks. Let's talk about Republicans blocking efforts to raise a minimum wage. Let's talk about Republicans trying to cut Social Security and Medicare. The audience in the studio, mostly Fox News employees and invited guests who usually supported Ingraham, was starting to shift uncomfortably. They had expected to see a young Democratic politician get destroyed on live television. Instead, they were watching their host get systematically dismantled by someone who clearly knew her stuff. Ingraham was starting to look flustered. Her usual tricks weren't working. And Crockett was turning every attack into an opportunity to go on the offense. The host tried to regain control by changing subjects. Let's talk about crime, Ingraham said, thinking she was moving to safer ground. Your district has seen increases in certain types of crime, yet you continue to oppose common-sense law enforcement measures. How do you explain that to families who don't feel safe in their own neighborhoods? But once again, Crockett was ready with facts. Laura, crime in my district has actually decreased in most categories since I took office, Crockett said, pulling out her phone to reference specific statistics. But more importantly, I supported real solutions to crime, like funding education, creating jobs, and addressing the root causes of violence. What I don't support are the failed policies of mass incarceration that have destroyed communities without making anyone safer. She paused for effect, then delivered what would become the most quoted line of the interview. The difference between us, Laura, is that you think crime is just a talking point to scare voters. I think it's a real problem that requires real solutions, not just tough guy rhetoric from people who live in gated communities. The camera captured Ingraham's face at that moment. A mixture of shock, anger, and the dawning realization that she was losing control of her own show. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word of this unexpected battle. But Crockett wasn't done. She could sense that she had Ingraham on the ropes, and her legal instincts told her to press her advantage. You know what, Laura? Crockett said, her voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute conviction. Since you want to question my qualifications and my record, let's talk about yours. Let's talk about your history of promoting conspiracy theories that have hurt real people. Let's talk about your pattern of attacking anyone who doesn't look like you or think like you. Ingraham tried to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand in a gesture that somehow commanded silence, even through the television screen. No, Laura, I'm not done. You had your time to attack me. Now, it's my turn to speak some truth. The control room at Fox News was in panic mode. Producers were frantically gesturing to Ingraham, suggesting she cut the commercial. But the host seemed frozen, unable to regain control of her own show. Crockett continued, her legal training evident in the way she methodically built her case. You built your career on dividing Americans, on making people afraid of each other, on telling working families that their problems are caused by other working families, instead of the powerful interests that actually control their lives. You've made millions of dollars selling fear and hatred, and now you have a nerve to question whether I'm qualified to serve the people. The camera showed Ingram's face growing redder by the second. She was gripping her pen so tightly her knuckles were white. And for the first time in years, she seemed genuinely unsure how to respond. But Crockett was just getting started. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a folder that she had been saving for this exact moment. Since you like to talk about records, Laura, let's talk about yours. Let's talk about the time you mocked Parkland shooting survivors. Let's talk about your history of racist comments. Let's talk about how you've consistently been on the wrong side of every major civil rights issue of our time. She opened the folder and began reading from prepared notes, her voice taking on the rhythm of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. March 28, 2018, you attacked a teenager who survived a mass shooting for speaking out about gun violence. August 2018, you said demographic changes were making America the America we know and love doesn't exist anymore. Should I continue? The studio audience was completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed transfixed by what was happening. Ingram, who had spent decades perfecting the art of the aggressive interview, was experiencing something she had never felt before. Being completely outmatched by a guest who was smarter, better prepared, and more skilled at verbal combat than she was. Aram, finally, found her voice, but it came out as a weak attempt to deflect, rather than her usual commanding tone. Those are taken out of context, she said. But even she seemed to know how pathetic it sounded. Crockett smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the smile of an attorney who had just gotten the confession she needed out of context. She repeated, Laura, there's no context that makes mocking school shooting survivors acceptable. There is no context that makes racist dog whistles okay. There is no context that justifies the damage you've done to our national discourse. She leaned forward, looking directly into the camera, as if speaking to every person watching across America. This is what I want everyone watching to understand. This is what the new generation of leaders represents. We're not going to be intimidated by bullies who think they can say whatever they want without consequences. We're not going to let hate and division be normalized just because someone has a television show. The moment was electric. Crockett had done something that seemed impossible. She had taken control of Laura Ingram's show and turned it into her own platform. The host, who had built her career on dominating politicians, was being dominated by a politician who refused to play by the old rules. But Crockett wasn't finished. She had one more devastating blow to deliver. You want to know what really qualifies me to serve in Congress, Laura? It's not just my education or my experience, though I'm proud of both. It's the fact that I've never forgotten where I came from. I've never forgotten what it's like to worry about paying bills, to face discrimination, to feel like the system is rigged against you. She paused, letting the words sink in, before delivering her final line. The difference between us is that I got into politics to help people who look like me and people who don't look like me, people who share my beliefs and people who don't. You got into media to attack people who don't look like you and don't think like you, and that's why, at the end of the day, I'm going to win, and you're going to lose. The silence that followed was deafening. For a full 10 seconds, an eternity in television time, neither woman spoke. Ingram sat there, mouth slightly open, clearly struggling to process what had just happened to her. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper. We'll be right back, she said, and the show cut to commercial. During the break, the footage from the control room would later show Ingram, slumped in her chair, shaking her head in disbelief, while Crockett sat calmly, checking her phone, as if she had just completed a routine task. The contrast was striking. The veteran media personality, looking defeated and confused, while Crockett appeared completely composed and ready for whatever came next. Network executives watching from their offices were already making frantic phone calls. This wasn't just a bad interview for Ingraham. This was a potential career-ending disaster. In the span of 30 minutes, one of their biggest stars had been systematically dismantled by a guest who had turned their own studio into a courtroom, where Ingraham was a defendant. The makeup artist, who touched up both women during the break, would later tell friends that the difference between them was like night and day. Ingraham's makeup had to be completely redone to hide the stress and perspiration, while Crockett looked exactly the same as when she had walked in, poised, confident, and completely in control. When they returned from commercial, Ingraham tried to regain some semblance of control, but it was too late. The damage was done, and everyone watching could see it. She stumbled through a few more questions, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. Crockett answered each one with the same calm confidence, occasionally landing additional blows that left Ingraham looking even more flustered. The interview ended with Ingraham thanking her guests in the most half-hearted way possible, while Crockett smiled and said, "Thank you for having me, Laura. This was fun. We should do it again sometime." As the cameras stopped rolling, the studio erupted in chaos. Producers were already fielding calls from network executives. Social media was exploding with clips from the interview, and everyone present knew they had just witnessed something historic. The impact of Jasmine Crockett's demolition of Laura Ingraham was immediate, and unlike anything political media had seen in years. Within minutes of the interview ending, social media exploded with clips, reactions, and analysis of what many were calling the most devastating takedown in television history. The first video to go viral was a 2-minute supercut of Crockett's most devastating moments, titled, "Jasmine Crockett Destroys Laura Ingraham." Within an hour, it had been viewed over 500,000 times. By morning, that number would reach 15 million across all platforms. Twitter was the first battlefield where the aftermath played out. Hashtag Jasmine Crockett began trending within 30 minutes, followed quickly by hashtag Ingraham Destroyed and hashtag New Generation Leaders. The responses fell into predictable patterns, but the sheer volume was unprecedented. Progressive activists and Democratic politicians rushed to share clips, with captions like, "This is what fighting back looks like." And finally, someone who doesn't back down to Fox News bullies, Alexandria Ocasio, tweeted a fire emoji with a caption, "When they go low, we go lower. They expectations into the ground." The tweet got 200,000 likes in 2 hours. Even more surprising was a reaction from unexpected corners. Some conservative commentators, while disagreeing with Crockett's politics, admitted grudging respect for her performance. Ben Shapiro tweeted, "Disagree with her politics completely, but Jasmine Crockett clearly came prepared for battle." Ingraham walked into a buzzsaw. The tweet sparked furious debate among his followers about whether he were betraying conservative principles or simply acknowledging political skill. The immediate aftermath at Fox News was chaotic. Network executives had spent years building Ingraham's brand around her ability to dominate liberal politicians. Seeing her so thoroughly outmatched on her own show created an unprecedented crisis of confidence. Emergency meetings were called, and within hours, rumors began circulating that the network was considering major changes to Ingraham's show format. Ingraham herself initially tried to control the damage through social media. She tweeted, "Had a spirited discussion with Jasmine Crockett tonight. Glad we could have a real conversation about the issues that matter to Americans." But the tweet fell flat, receiving more negative responses and positive ones, with many pointing out that calling it a spirited discussion was like calling the Titanic a minor shipping incident. The reaction from Democratic leadership was swift and unified. House Speaker Hakeem Jeff released a statement saying, Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated tonight why the American people sent a new generation of leaders to Congress. Her intelligence, preparation, and courage in the face of hostility exemplify the best of our democratic values. But perhaps more importantly, the response from ordinary Americans was electric. Democratic fundraising platforms reported a massive surge in donations, with Crockett's name mentioned in thousands of contribution notes. Small dollar donors, who had never heard her name before, were suddenly contributing to her campaign and progressive causes in general. The most telling indicator of the interview's impact came from focus groups conducted in the days following. Even among Republican voters, Crockett's favorability ratings had increased significantly. While they still disagreed with the politics, many respected her intelligence and her refusal to be intimidated. One focus group participant in Ohio said, "I don't agree with anything she stands for, but damn, that woman knows how to fight." The long-term implications began to emerge in the following weeks. Booking agents for political talk shows reported that Democratic politicians were suddenly much more willing to appear on hostile programs. The success of Crockett's aggressive counterattack strategy had given other Democrats a playbook for how to handle hostile media environments. Media criticism became more intense as well. Journalism schools began using the interview as a case study in how aggressive questioning can backfire when the interviewer is unprepared for an equally aggressive response. Some media ethics experts argued that Ingram's approach had always been more about entertainment than journalism, and Crockett's response had exposed the intellectual emptiness behind the hostile persona. The interview also sparked broader conversations about representation in media and politics. Crockett's performance demonstrated that the assumption that young politicians, particularly young politicians of color, would be easy targets for experienced media figures, was dangerously outdated. A new generation of leaders had arrived, who were not only unintimidated by traditional power structures but were actively willing to challenge them. For Crockett, personally, the interview transformed her from a respected but relatively unknown congresswoman into a national political figure. Speaking requests poured in from across the country. Major donors who had never heard of her began reaching out. Political analysts started mentioning her as a potential candidate for higher office, including speculation about future runs for Senate or even president. The impact on political fundraising was immediate and substantial. In the 48 hours following the interview, Crockett's campaign raised more money than it had in the previous 6 months combined. More importantly, progressive candidates across the country reported significant fundraising boosts, with donors specifically mentioning Crockett's performance as inspiration for their contributions. Conservative media was forced to reckon with what had happened. Some doubled down, claiming that Crockett had been disrespectful, and that the interview proved Democrats couldn't handle civil discourse. But others began questioning whether the aggressive, confrontational style that had served conservative media well for decades was still effective against a new generation of Democratic politicians who were willing to fight fire with fire. The most significant long-term impact may have been on political messaging and strategy. Democratic consultants began advising their clients to study Crockett's performance, particularly her ability to flip attacks back on her questioner, and her preparation with specific facts and dates. The era of Democrats playing defense in hostile media environments was officially over. Progressive organizations reported massive spikes in volunteer applications and membership, with many new recruits specifically citing Crockett's interview as an inspiration for getting involved in politics. The performance had given many people hope that Democratic politicians could successfully fight back against what they saw as unfair media treatment. Academic analysis of the interview focused on Crockett's use of legal techniques in a political context. Her background as a prosecutor was evident in how she built her case against Ingram, presenting evidence methodically, and never allowing herself to be thrown off a game plan. Political science professors began incorporating the interview into their courses as an example of effective political communication under pressure. Law schools also took notice, with several institutions inviting Crockett to speak about the intersection of legal training and political communication. Her ability to maintain composure under hostile questioning, while systematically dismantling her opponent's credibility, became a case study in courtroom tactics applied to media appearances. The interview also had international impact. News outlets around the world covered the story, with many focusing on what it revealed about the changing nature of American political discourse. The BBC ran a segment titled, "How a Texas Congresswoman Changed American Political Media," while German and French news programs analyzed the interview as evidence of a generational shift in American politics. International observers noted that Crockett's performance represented a new model of political communication that prioritized substance over style, and preparation over charisma. Perhaps most importantly, the interview changed expectations for political communication. Young political staffers across the country began preparing their bosses for more aggressive media appearances, knowing that the old playbook of avoiding tough questions and staying on message might not be enough anymore. The standard had been raised, and everyone in political media knew it. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the interview represented more than just one politician having a good night on television. It marked the arrival of a new style of political communication that refused to accept the premise that Democratic politicians should be grateful for any media attention, even hostile attention. Crockett had shown that it was possible to not just survive hostile interviews, but to use them as platforms for delivering powerful messages and building national profiles. The transformation was complete when, 3 months later, Ingraham's show was quietly moved to a later time slot, while Crockett was invited to host a special primetime town hall on a major network. The student had not just challenged a teacher, she had replaced her for American politics. The message was clear. A new generation of leaders had arrived, and they weren't interested in playing by the old rules. They were ready to write new ones, and as Jasmine Crockett had proven, they had the skills and the courage to win on any battlefield, including the most hostile television studios in the country. The final word came from Crockett herself, in a tweet posted exactly 1 week after the interview. "To everyone who asked if I was nervous about going on that show, I wasn't nervous. I was prepared. There's a difference. And it's everything." That tweet perfectly captured what made a performance so devastating and so inspiring. In an era of political communication dominated by sound bites and spin, she had brought substance, preparation, and genuine conviction. She had shown that the best way to handle a bully isn't to avoid them or appease them, but to be better prepared, more knowledgeable, and more committed to the truth than they are. The interview had ended Laura Ingraham's reputation as an unbeatable political interview, and launched Jasmine Crockett into the national spotlight. But more than that, it had changed the entire landscape of political media, proving that the old assumptions about who holds power in these exchanges were not just wrong, but dangerously outdated. As political observers looked toward the future, one thing was certain. The era of Democratic politicians being intimidated by hostile media was over. Jasmine Crockett had seen to that, and American politics would never be the same.